Welcome to Chapter Select, where we discuss narratives in video games. As a result, this video is full of spoilers for both A Plague Tale: Innocence and Roki. Also, apologies in advance for any butchered Scandinavian pronunciations, I tried my best. Last year, I played two similar titles quite close together. One of these was a game I was a year late to playing, while the other was a 2020 release. However, at their core, they had a similar concept. They were both about teenage girls with little brothers. The brothers are both wanted by a villainous figure because the brother is special and will help the villain in their selfish aims somehow. And it is up to the big sister, who the player controls, to protect this little brother. However, beyond this concept, the two titles were almost the opposite of each other in every way. One game, A Plague Tale: Innocence, was a dark third-person stealth game in a harsh, cruel world. It featured violence and murder and was absolutely not suitable for most of its underage cast to be able to play.
I can't play it. I'm not 18.
And then there's Roki, a point-and-click game with a bright, colourful aesthetic, limited violence and no combat. Its world is one of whimsy, where its protagonist befriends most of the characters she meets and is much more family friendly. But it goes a lot deeper than that, so with the announcement of a sequel to A Plague Tale, I wanted to examine the games side by side and look at their vastly different approaches of telling a story about sibling relationships and about a girl rapidly growing up. Let's break down the basic premise of each game and the relationship between brother and sister in each. In A Plague Tale: Innocence, we play as Amicia de Rune, the daughter of a French knight. Her life of wealth and privilege is torn apart when her dog Leon is eaten by rats, and then the Inquisition kill her father and most of the house staff. Fleeing with her brother Hugo, they must learn to survive in a world full of war, disease, and an Inquisition that wants to capture Hugo for mysterious purposes. Much of the game is about Amicia's efforts to keep her brother from harm and survive in this harsh new reality. In Roki, we play as Tove Jacobsen, who lives in a cabin in the mountains with her father and little brother Lars. One day, a monster arrives at the cabin, destroying the property and forcing the siblings to flee in search of help. They get separated and Lars ends up captured and taken into a mysterious magical forest. Tove must rescue him from the clutches of the monster and the figure who's in charge of it. You may already spot some differences in the family dynamic here. Amicia and Hugo don't have much of a relationship at the start of A Plague Tale. The beginning of the game makes it clear that the de Rune family is split. Amicia spends a lot of time with her father and rarely sees her mother, who spends much of her time holed up in her alchemy lab looking after Hugo, who suffers a mystery chronic condition of some kind. When everything falls apart and Amicia is forced to flee with Hugo, the two siblings don't have much of an established relationship. In fact, during the opening chapter as the chaos breaks out, she introduces herself to him, emphasizing this.
It's me. Your sister? Amicia?
Hello.
Following this, Amicia is forced to bond with her brother, and the relationship that builds out of this is a major plot point across the whole game. And that relationship starts out strained and awkward. Amicia is trying to process what's happened to her parents and her home, while Hugo is largely oblivious to a lot of what's going on. Amicia chooses to keep their mother's supposed death a secret from him, believing him to be too young to understand, but Hugo presses the issue, and this leads to a major clash between the two not long into their journey that puts them into potential danger.
Put that mallet down! Are you stupid or what?
I am not stupid!
Don't shout!
Children, that's enough noise.
I want to see Mummy!
Shut up! You're going to get us killed!
Mummy will protect us!
That's enough!
I want to see Mummy!
Mummy is dead, Hugo! You'll never see her again. Or Daddy.
And in this clash, we can see just how little connection these two have. Hugo spends most of the time wondering where his mummy is, while Amicia is short with Hugo, more used to interacting with adults like her father and the family staff than she is her baby brother. And it's only when she's forced to kill to save him that they reconcile, But even then, it's still a fraught relationship, largely because it's against the backdrop of a stressful time for them both. Amicia helps to protect her brother through rat plagues, fire, and a deadly battlefield before rescuing him after they're captured. And because of this, Hugo learns to stay close to his sister and that he can't just run off and do what he wants. Her protection is largely out of a desperate desire to cling to whatever family she has left, but she comes to like Hugo and all his quirks by the end of the game. This does suffer a little while into the story, however, when Amicia learns that her mother is still alive, but chooses to keep it a secret from Hugo. He overhears this, and her refusal to be straight with him undoes the trust that they've built. He ends up getting captured when he decides to head off and try to rescue his mother on his own. There's even a section where you play as him, where the comments he makes occasionally reveal his resentment from his sister for lying about their mom, while wanting to prove that he doesn't need her to protect him.
If only Amicia was here. No, I don't need her.
This resentment leads to him briefly joining the villain, and it's only through Amicia's determined push to free him in a tense chapter that he recognises his sister does care for him. He also does prove himself, largely because he has magic rat powers now, don't ask, and Amicia willingly lets him help to show that she values him. It's a complex clash of two people, both of whom are still children and naive to a lot of things. Hugo is too young to understand the complexities of Amicia's decision to protect him from the knowledge of what's happening in the wider world, while Amicia's clumsy handling of the situation is down to her being 15, and therefore still unsure of herself and the world around her, making her unclear on how to look after a brother that she's barely interacted with until now. At the end of the game, the two are much closer, hanging out in a marketplace and being friendly. This is mostly evident in Hugo wanting to race Amicia back to their cart, and she happily joins in with his playtime. Roki ends with this same scene of the sister playfully agreeing to race her little brother back home, but the journey that it takes them to get there is very much the opposite of what happens in A Plague Tale. Unlike Amicia and Hugo, Tove and Lars are shown to have an established relationship from the very start of the game. We're introduced to them both as she accompanies him in his playtime out in the wilderness around their home. She's adopted a guardian status, and the way they interact makes it clear that they are close. She repairs a toy of his, cooks dinner for the whole family, and reads stories for him in their shared bedroom. She even has an affectionate nickname for him, Tiny Tomte, that she uses frequently. And where Hugo in A Plague Tale needs time to bond with and then trust his older sister, Lars here clearly feels that way about Tove from the outset. But in contrast to A Plague Tale, the opening hours of the game and the ending are the only time we see the siblings interact with one another. In fact, they remain separated for the game's duration, and the driving force of the plot is in reuniting them. But even within this absence, there are clear indications that these siblings love and care for each other. Tove frequently reflects on her missing brother, and mentions of other characters losing family members make her sad, yet even more determined to find Lars. When we get scenes of what's happening to Lars, there are moments where he thinks of Tove and seems to perk up at the idea that she might be coming to find him. He believes in her and wants to see her just as much as she's determined to find him. But the differences between these stories are notable in how much they mirror each other. A Plague Tale is all about a distant sister and brother being forced together in dire circumstances, while Roki is about a close brother and sister forced apart in dire circumstances. But it's not just the sibling relationship that sees these two games mirrored. We can also see this in the wider family dynamic. As well as an older daughter and a younger son, in both cases there is a dead parent, and a parent who appears to die but ends up alive and central to helping the siblings later. Where this dynamic differs is in the gender of the living and dead parents, and in when the dead parent passed away. In A Plague Tale, Amicia believes both of her parents die as a result of the Inquisition's arrival. She witnesses her father Robert getting struck down by the Inquisitor, while a blade through a door after getting separated from her mother Beatrice makes her assume the worst. In Roki, Tove's father Henrik is trapped in the house when it collapses due to monster-related damages, and she can only assume the worst as she and her brother escape. However, her mother, Eva, was already dead before the game began. In fact, this loss is central to the story, with both Tove and Henrik coming to terms with losing her in varying ways. This is a stark contrast to Robert de Rune, who rarely gets mentioned as the game progresses. There's a solemn scene near the end of the game when Amicia returns to her home and mourns over his body, but he's weirdly not mentioned all that much for the rest of the game. However, the presumed dead but actually alive parents do reflect each other much better. Their revivals are opposites of one another. Beatrice isn't killed, but is instead captured for her knowledge as an alchemist, and she gets rescued later. Henrik, meanwhile, awakes in relative safety, and then charges into the forest to try to find his children. One is in danger and needs to be removed from it, while the other puts himself in danger to try and remove someone else from it. Both are important in aiding the characters, however. It's through her research as an alchemist that Beatrice is able to understand the affliction her son suffers, and is able to guide him when he gains magical rat powers. Don't ask. It's also why she's kept alive in the first place, allowing her to be rescued. Without her knowledge, she likely would have been slaughtered like her staff. She accompanies the player on 2 separate occasions too, and in both instances she acts as a tutorial. There's the aforementioned rat power instruction, don't ask, when you briefly play as Hugo, while back at the start of the game she is the character who guides Amicia in stealth as they try to escape the estate. Henrik's assistant role in Roki is a more active one, so active in fact that you play as him. In the final section of the game, Henrik charges into the forest to find a spooky abandoned castle, the same one Tove finds herself in, with the caveat that they're both on separate sides of a magical veil. Henrik is in our world, while Tove is deep within the mythical one. In fact, this section illustrates another significant difference between A Plague Tale and Roki, which aspect of the family dynamic each game focuses on. While A Plague Tale puts its focus primarily in the sibling relationship, with the parental relationship secondary, Roki focuses on the entire family dynamic, with Tove and Lars' relationship only a small part of that whole. As we move through the final section of the game, we are witnessing character growth in Henrik. At the start of the game, he's shown to be spending most of his time sleeping in front of the fire and neglecting his duties as a father. Tove is the one holding the family together as best as she can despite her young age, and it's made obvious through dialogue that Henrik's lethargy stems from the death of his wife. His grief has consumed him, sapping him of his will and motivation, and in the final section of the game, after waking to a destroyed house, he realises he hasn't been there for his children and vows to fix this. And when you play as both him and Tove, they begin to sense each other across the veil, even if they can't directly see or hear each other to begin with. And it's through desperate attempts to communicate with his daughter that he strengthens his resolve and vows to be a better father. Tove in turn is happy to realise that her dad is there and no longer sleeping in his own grief, and as they aid each other through supernatural means, it culminates in this moment where they're finally able to hear each other and express their feelings. In this instance, not only does the spectral veil drop, allowing them to communicate, but so too does the barrier that grief has formed between them. But where do Eva and Lars fit into all of this? Based on flashbacks, it's clear that before Lars' birth, the family was close-knit and that Tove deeply loved both her parents. She has nothing but fond memories of her mother, and this is a source of sadness for her, one that she likely hasn't been able to process properly due to her emotionally absent father and being forced into the role as head of the household. It also turns out that her nickname for Lars was actually her mom's nickname for her, and she's carried the name along as she becomes a replacement mother for her little brother. Lars, however, has no relationship with his mother. She died in childbirth, out in the snow due to an unexpected labour and a scared Tove not being able to find a public phone to call for help. Lars does express a slight sadness at not knowing his mom from time to time, but obviously doesn't experience her loss in the way that his father and sister do. But the interesting thing is, the sadness is never directed at Lars. He's never blamed for her death, despite it being his birth that killed her. Instead, Tove refers to him as Mama's last gift to us, which further hammers home just how close this entire family unit is. Family is important to all of them, and they all truly care for each other even when it's hard. And it's a sweet reflection on familial love that makes up the heart of the whole game. So the sibling relationship of both games and the overall family relationship are opposites of each other, but this also extends to the setting of both games. First, the key similarity is that both stories are set in mainland Europe, and the countries they're set in are important to the stories being told. A A Plague Tale is set in the historical region of Aquitaine in southern France, while Roki is set in an unspecified Scandinavian location, although the use of language signifiers like Beklager and Tak indicate Norway. Well, this is where similarities end, however. While the game set in France was developed by a French team, the game set in Norway was developed by a British team. More obviously differing the two, however, is the approach to setting. A Plague Tale is set in historical France during 1348, where France and England called a truce during the 100 Years' War due to the emergence of the Black Death. Meanwhile, Roki is a fantasy setting drawing from the folklore of Scandinavia, and the time period is ambiguous due to the mountainous rural region, but Henrik owning a car makes it at least 20th century if it's not contemporary. One story is historical, and the effects of war and plague in historical France is a major aspect of the game's story, with battlefields strewn with English and French bodies, houses marked with crosses to indicate plague infection, and a paranoid Catholic Inquisition being key parts of the world. The other story is driven from folklore, with creatures like trolls and tomte being central to the world, along with a story that reads a lot like traditional folk tales from Norway. The game is fundamentally a point-and-click adventure drawing from the conventions of the genre, but reading those old folk tales, it's easy to see why that setting was chosen to marry with this gameplay, as they often feature heroes finding magical items and using them in highly specific ways to trick creatures to progress to their goal. If you read tales like Rich Man Peddler Purr, The Three Princesses in Whiteland, or The Husband's Daughter, it's clear their characters' actions are not too dissimilar to Guybrush Threepwood using a monkey as a wrench, so the genre choice is logical for the setting. This opposition in setting also leads to an opposition in tone too. Since A Plague Tale draws from history, it presents itself as grittier, more serious, and unflinching in its depictions of the grim time period it's set in. And since Roki draws from folk tales, which were often simple and moralistic, used as parables for even young children to understand, its tone is much lighter, with its dangers being much less obvious than what Amicia and Hugo face. The threats to Amicia are grim. Soldiers will have no qualms with throwing a spear through her chest or cutting her down with a sword if she's spotted. The ever-present rats causing the plague can devour her whole if she gets too close, and the game does not shy away from showing a teenage girl being brutally killed in these ways. They are bloody, they are horrible, and Amicia will scream for her life. Admittedly, the flesh-eating rats are a slight deviation from the reality of the Black Death, but avoiding bacteria that causes horrible boils would be much harder to turn into a video game, and Hugo also wouldn't be able to gain magical rat powers. Don't ask. In contrast, the threats faced by Tove are much tamer. For much of the game, she rarely faces any direct threat to her life, aside from maybe an encounter with a giant spider that wants to eat her. However, in-game, Tove literally cannot die. There is no fail state. Hindrances to progress in Roki are usually getting stuck on puzzles, not being eaten by trolls. Even the fight against that giant spider is non-violent, with Tove merely holding it back using light. It does get eaten by one of the giants Tove requires the assistance of, but even that's presented in a somewhat tame manner. The difference in these threats can also be seen in how the villains are presented. In both cases, we have a villain who wants the younger brother of our lead to aid in some magical or pseudo-magical way. Hugo in A Plague Tale is infected with what's known as the macula, which is connected to the plague, and the head Inquisitor Vitalis wants him for his blood so that he can gain its special properties, such as the magical rat powers. Don't ask. Lars in Roki is a forest-born child due to his parents failing to reach the hospital during his mother's labour, but this makes him easily affected by the forest's magic, and the wayward raven giant Roka wants that magical essence to turn her beast child into a human. However, they are not the same in their presentation. Vitalis is a cruel, evil man whose goals are entirely selfish. He wants power and is willing to mutilate himself in horrible ways in order to achieve it. He doesn't care about the livelihoods of anyone around him, and is willing to exploit a small child in order to reach his aims. At the end of the game, the final confrontation sees him even attempting to kill miners, and the only way to take him down is to kill him with a stone violently flung through his head from a sling. Roka is much more complex as a character. Her goals are selfish, but she believes them not to be. She truly believes that her son would be better if he could be turned human, as his heritage as the child of a forest guardian and a human is one that's led to him being ostracised on both sides. She is determined to protect and save him, and in the process of trying to use Lars as a catalyst for the transformation, she also hurts herself severely. But unlike Vitalis, who revels in his own monstrosity, she expresses sadness at the toll it's taking on her. Similarly, she isn't killed at the end of the game. Instead, Tove mentally resists Roka's attempts to break her, and her son, the titular Roki, aids Tove in pointing out that in her efforts to save him, she never once asked him how he felt. And during the magical process, he and Lars bonded, making him even more aware that not everyone would turn away from him in horror. Vitalis and Roka are villains suited to their stories. Vitalis is a selfish man whose rampant, reprehensible nature is a representation of the dark horror presented throughout a plague tale, while Roka's story of being little more than a misguided mother who just wants the best for her child is representative of the lighter, family-driven tale of Roki that draws from folk tales with morals and life lessons. But what do these two different kinds of tale tell us about our teenage protagonists? In both games, we have a girl who is forced to grow up under tough circumstances and how that forced growth affects them. Both girls are fundamentally affected by tragedy and trauma, but their stories are different in their approaches. While A Plague Tale sees us witnessing Amicia's trauma in real time, Tove's trauma in Roki happens before the story, only shown to us later in flashbacks. As such, the process of growth that each game shows is drastically different. Let's start with Tove's journey. The birth of her brother led to the death of her mother, and the depression of her father. Due to his retreat into sleep and alcohol, Tove is forced to grow up in that moment before we've even met her. She's forced to become Lars's guardian, as we witness at the start of the game. But the problem with all of this is that she doesn't get time to process her own grief, instead having to cope for her father's. And in the events of Roki, this is something she has to do repeatedly, and the adventure pushes her growth to completion. The best comparison for this kind of story would be fantasy movies like Labyrinth or Spirited Away, both of which feature young girls forced to grow up in supernatural folklore-driven fantasy worlds. Labyrinth is the most apt comparison, as both stories see a teenage girl's little brother snatched away by monsters, and the girl has to follow into the world to get him back. However, Roki features much less of David Bowie and his space oddity, and much of that film's sexual awakening subtext is absent. Instead, this is where the Spirited Away comparison comes in, as Chihiro's foray into the spirit world heavily resembles Tove's time in the Enchanted Forest, where fantasy creatures who initially pose a threat finding themselves sympathetic of the poor human girl's plight and aiding her. They also both feature female villains driven by a twisted version of motherhood, both of whom come to grow in their own ways. Both believe they're protecting a child who then turns round and calls them out on their smothering ways thanks to the courage provided by the humans who came into their world. But if Roki is spirited away, A Plague Tale is Grave of the Fireflies, a grim tale about siblings being forced to survive together in a harsh time of war, one of whom is too young to truly understand what's happening. A Plague Tale is about the loss of innocence, as the title rather obviously states. Amicia lives a privileged life as the daughter of a respected knight. She grew up in a mansion surrounded by staff and had all the comforts a girl could want. But the events of the game strip her out of that environment and force her to adapt. Her initial reactions are panic and horror, and she's never allowed to process this as she immediately realizes that she must protect her brother. Amicia also has to learn how to kill to survive, particularly when they find themselves in a plague-ridden village distrustful of visitors. She has to kill a man to save Hugo from his clutches, and then a second man, Conrad, who is leading the village in their fervour. Both deaths affect Amicia greatly, but she gets no time to process what's happening, forcing her to harden to it. And while she grows and matures throughout the course of the story, it's not necessarily always for the better. This hardened attitude makes her a fierce protector, but there's a question of how well she'll be able to cope long term with the trauma of her journey. It's quite possible we'll see some of this explored in Requiem when that releases next year, but for now, it's not looking good for her mental state. The stark difference in these personal stories is just another in the long list of how these two seemingly different games contrast and reflect one another. A big sister protecting a little brother, the loss of parents, the journey that sees the girl become a stronger woman by the end. All of these are elements the games have in common, but they're the light and dark versions of how that story can be told. Comparing these two shows that two stories with near identical premises can still be told in drastically different ways. And with that, we've reached the end of today's episode of Chapter Select. If you've enjoyed this, please like the video and make sure you're subscribed for future videos like this. And if you can, I'd really appreciate some support over on Patreon, which will help fund future videos like this. And I will see you again very soon.